Okay, so in the last module, we focused on mutations, and especially neutral mutations, how they can cause evolutionary changes in a population without having any impact on the fitness of organisms. They're not more fit, they're not less fit, they're just genetically different, and according to our definition of evolution, that counts as evolution. This process of evolution wasn't really understood until the middle to late 20th century as people understood how genetics work and how we could kind of see how they spread through populations. The next one we're going to talk about is also random in the sense that we can't predict the future. We can't predict where the evolution is going to go, even if we know a great deal about genetics and ecology, unlike natural selection. But very much like mutations in the sense that it's non-Darwinian. It's a unpredictable or random form of evolution. This is genetic drift. So here's the situation. Let's start off with population. Just like last time, I'm color coding the genes, but the organisms pretty much look the same, but we've got green variants and white variants, and you'll see in this population, unlike the mutation scenario, we're mostly green. So green is more common. And in general, if this had evolved by natural selection, we might assume that green is more fit. But again, we're not going to assume that in this case. We'll just say this is where the population is now. And in genetic drift, what we're going to have is a process. And again, a reminder that if you read about genetic drift in the textbook, there's more subtle versions of genetic drift. The ones we're talking about in lecture and what will be on the exam is a more dramatic, trying to make it pretty dramatic so that it's obvious when we're talking about genetic drift. But in genetic drift, we have what's called a bottleneck event. And so in this case here, this is the same generation before the bottleneck and after. And you can see that a lot of things died. And that's what a bottleneck is. A bottleneck is some catastrophe. It could be a small catastrophe if you die by chance, but we're going to make it a big catastrophic catastrophe, a forest fire, a tsunami, a flood, a drought, a disease epidemic, some really dramatic thing that kills off a lot of things. And the key here with genetic drift is that the ones that survive are just lucky. They're at the right place at the right time and they survive. And the ones that died were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So genetic drift is fully random. So this is an evolution here. It's just a couple things survived and a lot of things died. And the ones that survive may or may not. It's entirely driven by chance, but could have, as in this scenario, a different population genetic structure than in their kind of pre-bottleneck population. So you can see before it was mostly green, but now the survivors just happen to be mostly in the white variant. And then we give them all equal fitness. They all have two offspring. There's no adaptation, there's no selection. They're all equally fit. So they're all equally fit. They all have two babies. And so in the future, this is called the founder effect. The founding population has an important influence on the future evolution of the population. So what we can see is from one generation through the bottleneck, by chance alone, we have evolution, a change in the population. It mostly went from mostly green to mostly white. Now, a common question I often get from students when we talk about this is this selection? Is white more fit than the green variant? Because if we didn't know the bottleneck happened, we didn't know that this catastrophe happened, and we just saw before and after, yeah, it actually looks like natural selection where the white was more fit. But in this case, that's not what caused the situation. It wasn't that the white survived longer and reproduced more offspring than the green. It was simply that one bad day happened or a bad episode happened, a bottleneck happened, and the ones that survived were by chance different genetically than the ones that died. And therefore, they're not more fit because they survived. They're fit, or there's no fitness here. Um, they're just lucky. A good way to think about this is if we had gone back to this scenario, could we predict when the catastrophe would happen? Realistically, no. We might have a sense that, okay, this time of year a hurricane's more common, but it's hard to know where a hurricane's going to hit. Again, we can do better science, so we can do a little bit more prediction, but you can't predict a year out where a hurricane's going to hit, and if it's going to be Category 1 or Category 5, or what the impact's going to be, or who's going to survive and who's not. It's really random. It's unpredictable at this sense. And if it wasn't a hurricane, maybe it was a fire, or maybe it was a drought, or maybe it was a disease, or maybe it was some new predator comes in, or some invasive species. You can't predict what the catastrophe is going to happen. All you know is at some point something's going to happen, but you can't predict it. And so in genetic drift, the evolution is really caused by the catastrophe and the lucky ones that survive. Um, a good way to think about this is that we use that example of the lottery. The chance that you will be the lottery player is basically it's never going to happen. But the chance that somebody's going to win it is guaranteed. The problem is you can never predict who it is. So this is kind of evolution by the lottery. Some things are very unlucky, some things are very lucky, and it just happens to be the lucky ones are the the ancestors of future descendants. So this is genetic drift. The idea of genetic drift, again, like neutral mutations, is a 20th century invention. We discovered it kind of in the 70s and 80s as we were seeing how populations would change in the face of non-adaptive types of evolutionary change. As we were trying to test Darwin's ideas in real populations, some cases it disproved using the rules that we talked about Darwin, everything was equally selected. They're equally fit. And so in that case, it can't be adaptation, but the population was still evolving. Turned out that in some of those cases, it was genetic drift. Um, the idea of genetic drift, you can think of it as like it's a boat that's stuck without an engine and it's just floating in the ocean and it goes where the ocean takes it, and the boat has no real kind of value. It's just going where the environment takes it, but not in a adaptive sense, just in a kind of a random sense. That's the genes are drifting kind of in the environment. Okay, another situation, just to give you a sense of why it's called a bottleneck, is you can imagine the population looks like this, a bunch of marbles representing different variants, and you shake out a few. Most of them die, a few of them survive. Chances are the ones that survive are going to be genetically different than their ancestors. Now, it is possible by chance alone that there is no evolution here, in the sense that the frequency of genes before and after stay perfectly the same. But statistically, that's unlikely to happen. There's going to be some subtle changes, but we're going to make it dramatic. Most things die, like 80, 90%, a few things survive. Now let's compare these mechanisms, these two unpredictable or non-Darwinian forms of evolution with selection. Let's start off with the population. We have equal numbers of white and green variants, or about that. And here we're going to do natural selection. And we know in this particular environment, where we start really is determined by whatever mutations have happened and whatever their past evolution was, whatever it was. But we're at this point here. We study the gene frequencies, and we know what the rules of the environment are. Our ecologist friends or environmental science friends tell us that. And we know in this environment that green is going to be more fit on average than the white variants. So they'll survive longer, they'll have more babies. The white variant will be less fit, they'll have less babies over time, which means they pass their genes on. And so in a very predictable fashion, as long as that environmental pressure stays about the same, and generally environmental pressures over the long term, well, over some period of time generally are pretty similar, then what we'll see is, as predicted, that the white that's selected against will become less common, and the green that's selected for will become more common, and the population not only evolves, but in this case, because the green was more fit, the future generations have more of the fit variants, which means the population as a whole is more successful. It's more fit. It's adapting to this environment. The things that work in the environment are the ones that have babies, and so their offspring inherit their genes, and so this case we can predict the future. So we can compare these. And again, in the textbook, there's other kind of random 20th century mechanisms, but we'll do these three because they're pretty distinct from one another. The key is that all population variation at one level is a result of mutations, which, as we know, are generated by random processes. They could be a neutral outcome. They could be a beneficial, they could be a deleterious or harmful outcome. Uh, but either way, we start with a kind of population that is basically has whatever genetic variation that was created by some random process. And then where we go from there in these three mechanisms is potentially very, very different. In mutations, especially if they're neutral mutations, it's going to be genetically different, but in a way that you can't predict. In genetic drift, it's going to be different, but as a result of whatever environmental catastrophe happens. And some are lucky and survive, and some are unlucky and perish. And in selection, the outcome is predictable. It's going to be driven by what the environmental pressures are. And so when you think about these three mechanisms, all of them start with kind of some kind of chaotic, kind of complicated, randomly generated population of mutations. And then let's see what happens. Well, what we find is that in the first two, mutations and genetic drift, you can't predict the outcome. It's going to be entirely unpredictable depending on where the mutation happens, what its effect's going to be, who gets it, when. In the genetic drift, it's dependent on what happens and where the organisms are. So we can't predict the outcome. But in Darwinian evolution and selection, whether it's natural selection or species selection or human selection, we have an outcome that is perfectly predictable, generally predictable. We get adaptation. And this is really why Darwin is so, so important to biology. So when you look around the world today, organisms make sense. In general, organisms are healthy, they're fit, they're able to survive long enough to reproduce in their worlds. That suggests that selection has been the dominant force in evolution. Inevitably, these other two are happening. We saw that mutations must be happening. In fact, in some cases, all three are happening at the same time, plus the other ones. The insight that Darwin had, and really since Darwin, no one's come up with a competing hypothesis, is that of all the mechanisms of evolutionary change biologists have invented and figured out and know that are happening in the world, only Darwin's idea is able to make a world where the outcome is predictable and not random, and the population adapts and becomes well suited. Because organisms in general are well suited to their environment, that's why we think selection has been the most important of all the evolutionary mechanisms in the history of life. That's why Darwin is so important. If you go back to that quote I read from his last sentence of The Origin of Species, um, he basically compares his idea, if true, to gravity. He says, before Sir Isaac Newton, we knew things fell, but we couldn't predict why and when and how, and with what speed and velocity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The world was kind of unpredictable because we didn't know the rules of physics. But Sir Isaac Newton said, well, no, here's some laws of physics, force equals mass times acceleration, some other things, and with that we can do enormous prediction. Darwin comes along and does the same thing. The world's really complicated, really amazing. And with this idea of selection, we can understand the world. The world now becomes inevitable in the sense that if we know what the environment is and the genetics, we can pretty much predict where it's going and how it got here. None of these other mechanisms get to that. So that's why Darwin is so important. Now, you may have heard sometimes there's controversy in evolution. Oh, even the scientists debate whether Darwin's correct. Let me just explain that. What we mean there is in this particular population of mice or rabbits or snakes or spiders or what have you, has the most recent changes that we've documented in the evolution of this population, primarily is it driven by mutations, genetic drift, or selection? That's the controversy. And there's a lot of study going on right now to try to figure that out because we know not all evolution is Darwinian. These other things plus others matter. The key issue is in this particular population, which is the most important process in their most recent evolution. And that's just not always easy to study. If you take genetics, you'll learn some tricks that we can use to test this that we're not going to cover here. It's called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium rules. And if you understand a little bit about how genetics works, then you can test among these scenarios, but we're not going to cover that in this semester. Okay, let's take a pause on this module, and then now we got time for a quick review question. So let's do two quick. As the words used by scientists, the word random most closely means, pause your computer, by now you should be expert at this. Clearly, when scientists use the word, it means unpredictable. predictable. Let's do one more. Which of the following takes a chaotic random world produced by randomness and creates an ordered, predictable fit between organisms and their environment? We don't have time, but pause your computer. The answer clearly is natural selection. That's the only idea